NATO will deploy 800,000 soldiers to the borders of Russia. Europe had long pretended, and convincingly, that it wasn't preparing for a possible Russian attack. As it turned out, Germany had been secretly developing plans to defend Europe and actively preparing for the last 2.5 years. According to the Wall Street Journal today, in the event of a war with Russia, which, according to some German military officials, could start as soon as tomorrow, Germany will become the main transportation hub for moving NATO units to the east. The leaders of the Bundeswehr began developing a plan for such a transfer 2.5 years ago. And now a secret 1,200-page document marks a return to the Cold War mentality, when civil society and infrastructure were prepared for constant cooperation with the military. This 1,200-page document contains many interesting things which we'll discuss today. At the same time, Italy submitted its report, which outlines clear plans for preparing a counteroffensive against Russia. In response to all the sabotage in recent months, the Italians say we need to act now, and if we are attacked in a hybrid way, we need to launch a hybrid attack against Russia. France recently tested nuclear weapons again after almost 30 years, let me remind you, after the abolition of conscription. French President Emmanuel Macron announced the return of military service due to the threat of new conflict in Europe from Russian aggression. In general, we'll talk about all of this in more detail. My name is Alexei Pecci, let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave any comment under this episode, and subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pecci News. The link is in the video description. And if you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. Any support you can give is appreciated. So, it turns out that in Europe they haven't been wasting time and have actually been preparing plans in case of a war with Russia, which is behaving more and more irrationally. And as it turns out, several countries in Europe have developed military documents regulating life in the country during wartime. As the Wall Street Journal writes today, in the event of a war with Russia, which according to some German military officials could start as soon as tomorrow, Germany will become the main transportation hub for moving NATO units to the east. Well, geography kind of contributes to this, and the movement of troops, let's say, is on an impressive scale. It turns out that the leaders of the Bundeswehr started developing a plan for such a transfer of troops to NATO's eastern flank 2.5 years ago. Now, this previously classified 1,200-page document essentially marks the country's transition to a wartime footing. This document contains many details, including some that may seem minor. For example, it covers how to regulate traffic on the Autobahn if troops and military equipment are being moved, what to do with bridges, how to reinforce them, and so on and so forth, where to station soldiers who are moving across the country to the eastern flank and things like that. That is, there are a lot of such small details that are spelled out very meticulously. The 1,200-page document is called the Operational Plan Germany and provides for and describes in detail the deployment of 800,000 German, American and other NATO troops to the east to the front line. It lists the ports, rivers, railways, highways and so on, along which military units and equipment will move, as well as the ways they will be supplied and protected along the way. And as it turns out, Germany is already conducting exercises to implement this plan. Well, for example, the Wall Street Journal describes the following. This fall, in eastern Germany, the defense contractor Rheinmetall experimentally set up such a field camp for 500 soldiers. With dormitories, there were 48 shower cabins, 5 refueling stations, a field kitchen, drone surveillance, armed security, which, by the way, had previously been checked for Russian and Chinese influence, and so on. This camp was built in 14 days and taken down in 7. It was an experiment to see how fast it could be done. What is needed so that when troops are being relocated, they can stop somewhere for a while. And as a result of these exercises, the Bundeswehr called for speeding up such deployments that would be needed for Allied troops across Europe. And after these exercises, Rheinmetall signed a contract worth 260 million euros to create these kinds of mobile camps for German and NATO troops. German and other NATO military assessments indicate Russia could be ready to attack alliance countries in 2 to 5 years. However, a possible cessation of hostilities in Ukraine would allow it to focus on replenishing the losses suffered there, strengthening the army, and building up military potential more quickly. Military experts believe Moscow is already actively waging a hybrid war in Europe. And here is Lieutenant General of the Bundeswehr Alexander Zollfrank, who is responsible for preparing the German army for military operations, said earlier this month that Russia could launch a limited-scale attack on NATO territory as soon as tomorrow, at any moment. And it's important to note here that European countries are preparing to repel aggression, including developing ways to quickly deliver soldiers and weapons to the eastern flank. And finally, a so-called military Schengen system is being created for this purpose, which should standardize the disparate rules, including technical, customs, communications, security, and so on. That is, obviously, each country has its own rules. To prevent tanks from being delayed at the border, they're preparing a military Schengen so they could, for example, leave from Spain. This tank could reach the easternmost flank non-stop. And demonstrating readiness to quickly repel an attack is part of the deterrence strategy. In Europe, do they also believe that if Russians see everything is well organized and runs smoothly, they might decide not to attack? Nearly 30 years after abolishing conscription, French President Emmanuel Macron announced the return of military service due to the risk of new armed conflict in Europe from Russian aggression. Macron presented the new program today during a visit to an infantry brigade stationed in the French Alps. As in Germany, national service in France will initially be voluntary, and young people aged 18 and 19 will serve for 10 months. There are no plans yet to reinstate the mandatory draft, which was abolished in 1996. Young volunteers will serve only on French territory. They will not be sent on military operations abroad, Macron noted. So, how is it here? What's interesting? This statement came amid Paris's plans to lead, together with the United Kingdom, a peacekeeping contingent that will be deployed in Ukraine if hostilities cease. At the same time, Macron tried to ease the tension caused by last week's statement from the head of the French Army's General Staff, Fabien Mondon. He said that France must be ready, quote, to lose its children, since Russia is preparing to confront our countries by 2030. Mondon's statement drew strong criticism from French politicians. At the same time, European military officials and intelligence officers have repeatedly claimed that Russia could attack NATO countries before the end of this decade. And now the new military service program in France is seen as a way to replenish the army with new recruits, as well as a source of reservists who can be called up in the event of a future war. And so, the French armed forces currently have about 200,000 active personnel and 47,000 reservists, and over the next 5 years, their numbers are expected to increase to 210,000 and 80,000 reservists respectively. Let me remind you that many European Union countries, especially in the East and North, have recently reinstated some form of conscription. And among the most recent examples, Latvia and Croatia have introduced mandatory military service. And in November, German politicians agreed on a law for universal military service. But Italy has launched another very important process within the European Union. They called to counterattack Russia already today. As Politico writes, Russia is ramping up the scale of hybrid warfare in Europe, whose response so far has been limited to indignant and threatening statements. But now, Italy's defense minister Guido Crosetto has published a 125-page report in which he called on his colleagues in the European Union to strike Russia right now. It is now known that the European Union is currently discussing how to respond to Russia's provocations, from cyber attacks to moving troops to the Russian border. But we'll talk about this with you in the next episode. I'll leave it at that for now. Your opinion, your conclusions, write them in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, click the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye all. Subtitles.